Okay, I think we are done for my bit. If I can ask Ramesh to come up and do his bit. You can just take the middle. Great, thank you very much. So, Ramesh, welcome.
Thanks, Stefan.
Well, nice to see colleagues in person.
It really is.
Exactly.
So
we'll give you the floor to brief us on your recent trip to Burkina Faso, and then we'll take some questions.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It is indeed a pleasure to see people here again. And also thank you for your interest in Burkina Faso and for this briefing. I recently visited the country, and I have left with two urgent messages for the international community. Firstly, and these are imperatives, firstly, we need to scale up the life-saving response now to meet growing humanitarian needs in many parts of the country. We've had increasing vulnerability, more displacement that we need to address. And secondly, we must act to prevent and act with credible solutions, sustainable solutions to prevent this from becoming a protracted crisis with no end point in sight, similar to all the other protracted crises we have, where in some cases have gone on for generations. If you don't do both, people will get stuck in a vicious cycle of conflict, climatic shocks, and humanitarian needs compounded by the COVID-19 crisis. This will obviously inevitably lead to more food shortages, more instability, and more displacement. Allow me to begin with some of my impressions of the visit to Burkina Faso. 1 million people have been driven from their homes by armed groups in just 1 year. It is the world's fastest growing displacement crisis. Host communities have generously welcomed many of the displaced and given them a measure of protection, their primary ask, and in some places, displaced people outnumber the residents 3 to 1. In one place I visited, there were 150,000 displaced persons supported by a community of 50,000. I met Fatoumata, and she's one of many there, a mother in the northern town of Djibo, which until recently was inaccessible because of the presence of armed groups. She has been forced from her home, from her livelihoods, by armed men driving around motorbikes, and is now surviving with the help of humanitarian groups and the local community. She told me she's enormously grateful for the protection of the local community provides, because that's the best sort of protection that can be afforded her today. And I heard this same message echoed by many displaced women, mothers who are very vulnerable to sexual violence by armed groups. Fatoumata wants to make a living for herself, something that she would do back in her home, and her children growing and selling vegetables on the local market. But she knows that today it is impossible for her to return home as long as this insecurity persists. The violence and climate change have also drastically reduced food production in Burkina Faso, as it has throughout the entire Sahel. 1 person in 10 is food insecure. And without the humanitarian assistance that they currently receive, thousands of families would go hungry. Nearly 1 million people have no access to medical care, and COVID-19 has only made the situation worse. Really worryingly, 2,200 schools are closed in these affected areas, depriving more than 300,000 children of education and putting them at risk of exploitation and abuse. In one of Burkina Faso's most affected regions, Sahel, school attendance has dropped to 25% in 2 years. This is an enormous impact, particularly on girls' futures, because as we have seen in other parts as a result of the COVID crisis as well, girls are the most unlikely to return to school when they do recommence. So all the effort, all the investment that we have made and others have made and governments have made to afford girls an education will be lost if they can't return to school. Humanitarian organizations have scaled up their presence in Burkina Faso and have tripled deliveries since 2019. Last year, they assisted more than 2.4 million people across the country. This year, a record 3.5 million people need aid. This is a 60% increase compared to January of 2020. And while needs continue to grow, the funding outlook for 2021 is not improving sufficiently. Partners have had to prioritize to ensure assistance for the next 6 months. WFP has intermittently reduced rations for displaced people since July 2020 due to increasing needs. Humanitarian organizations overall need an injection of cash to address these problems. During my visit, I also launched the Humanitarian Response Plan for 2021 together with the government and the NGO partners. If the plan is fully funded, we can reach almost 3 million people of the most vulnerable type. It requires just over $600 million to implement. And here I would really urge international donors to maintain their generosity and to step up their funding support for Burkina Faso. But humanitarian aid is not enough, and this goes back to my second point. It may keep Fatoumata and many others alive, but if the drivers of the crisis are not addressed, it can only keep them in a holding pattern, depending on aid, which, as we all know, will hugely impact their dignity, but also their ability to recover when the opportunity arrives. So sustainable action is really needed right now to shore up their resilience and reduce future needs. And our organizations, humanitarian organizations and development organizations, are well placed and ready to do that. They have the capacity, but they need resources. In this respect, I visited the city of Kaya, where partners such as UNICEF and NGOs have taken innovative steps to support local service networks and infrastructure with more sustainable solutions for the entire community, not just the displaced. And we need more support for these longer-term projects because they will afford recovery for these communities. And the crisis in Burkina Faso, as you know, is extremely complex, as it is throughout the Sahel. But most importantly now, and everyone told me this on the field, they need peace to prevent a protracted humanitarian crisis which suffocates the hope and the dignity of a very proud people. Life-saving action and rapid, credible development action must go hand in hand to reduce future needs. That means strengthening basic services, improving infrastructure and education, combating the impact of climate change, and create sustainable livelihood models for future generations. The recent $700 million envelope from the World Bank's Prevention and Resilience allocation for Burkina Faso is a good example and very welcomed. It will focus on crisis action and resilience at the same time through flexible funding. People in Burkina Faso are showing incredible strength in the face of near impossible challenges, and communities desperately need international support to get back on their feet. Their resilience is strong, but it is eroding. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll be very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ramesh. James Bays, Al Jazeera.
Thank you very much for doing this press conference. If I could ask you, I know you are dealing with the humanitarian situation on the ground, but clearly the security situation is very, very bad at the moment. And from a humanitarian viewpoint, are you happy with the international community's response to the security situation which impacts your work, given that across the border there are 15,000 peacekeepers in a mission? There's nothing like that for Burkina Faso. Mali appears on the Security Council agenda, Burkina Faso only in a sort of regional bundle. I mean, is it time for the UN and other parts of the UN outside what you're doing, the humanitarian work, to take this much more seriously?
Well, I think wherever you have violent conflict, what we would want is all possible measures taken to improve the situation and reduce conflict. As humanitarian actors, our main concern is access to the population. And we do this through negotiation with whoever impedes access. So it's important that they permit that access. But it's also equally important that they abide by international humanitarian law, that they ensure that they offer protection to these vulnerable groups, that they're not attacked, and that they're not displaced, because that's what leads to the biggest amount of vulnerability. So in this, we work within the conflict situation, and we're focusing very much on how we support those populations. So that's what we would say is our priority. But in any situation where you have a conflict, you need to have a host of different activities and initiatives to this. So it's we need development actors to support us to reduce needs. We need humanitarian assistance for immediate life-saving assistance, and obviously you need a resolution to the conflict. I mean that's imperative, but that obviously we have to leave to our political actors as well.
Thank you. Evelyn?
Thank you. What is the conflict? Is it ISIS? And if so, how do you stop it without peacekeeper or military action? I mean, you mentioned you needed peace. How do you get peace? I know there are gangs and there are other loose elements and armed groups around, but it seems ISIS seems the main one, or am I wrong?
Okay, well, I just want to very quickly say, obviously, I need peace, but most importantly, Fatoumata needs peace, and all those like her there, because that's what they really asked for. And what they're asking for is basically a lot of these armed groups that are around the area. They come from various backgrounds. Some of them are local, some of them are transnational. And I think the important thing is that there's a solution provided for Burkina Faso so that these elements do not rise up, that there's good development, that there's support for local communities there, that the infrastructure supports and basic services, etc. So we feel from a development perspective that a lot that can be done that can mitigate the need for such for violence in those areas as well.
Thank you. Any questions online? No, Ramesh, I think you are free to go.
Thanks very much,
Thank you
Stefan.
very
Thanks
much.
very much, everyone.
Hello.